There is a very specific moment in narcissistic relationships, a moment many survivors don't recognize at first. It's the moment when the narcissist begins to realize you're starting to see them clearly. You're no longer reacting the same way. You're no longer explaining yourself endlessly. You're no longer chasing their approval. And when this shift begins, the narcissist often starts behaving differently. Subtle changes appear, sometimes confusing ones, sometimes alarming ones. And today we're going to explore 7 signs the narcissist knows you're waking up. But pay close attention, because sign number 3 is the one most survivors completely miss. And it often reveals more about the dynamic than anything else. If you've been in a narcissistic relationship, you probably remember how much emotional energy it required. You analyzed conversations, you replayed arguments in your head. You tried to understand what went wrong. Sometimes you blamed yourself. Sometimes you wondered if you were asking for too much. And yet, something inside you slowly began noticing patterns. Moments where their reactions didn't make sense. Moments where your feelings were dismissed. Moments where the reality of the relationship felt distorted. At first, those realizations are quiet, almost uncomfortable, because seeing the pattern means confronting something painful. But once awareness begins, it rarely disappears. And this is where something interesting happens. Because narcissists are often extremely sensitive to changes in emotional dynamics, even subtle ones. And when they sense those changes, their behavior can shift in very revealing ways. Let's talk about the signs. At first, this might feel strange. You begin reacting less, you become calmer, more emotionally distant, and suddenly, the narcissist seems to provoke you more than usual. More criticism, more accusations, more comments designed to trigger a reaction. Why? Because reactions used to confirm something for them, that they still had influence over your emotions. But when your reactions become smaller or slower, they may increase the pressure, almost like testing the system, trying to see if the old buttons still work. But here's the part many survivors don't realize. When those buttons stop working the same way, the narcissist notices this can feel incredibly confusing. After tension, after argument, after emotional distance, suddenly they become kind again, affectionate, attentive. They may say things like, "I've been thinking about us. I don't want to lose what we have. I miss how things used to be." And hearing this can awaken something powerful, hope, because it reminds you of the beginning. But here's what many survivors later realize. This kindness often appears right when emotional control begins slipping, and that timing is rarely accidental. This is the sign most people miss, because it can feel incredibly personal. Suddenly, the narcissist starts saying things like, "You've changed, you're acting cold, you're different lately." And at first, you might question yourself. Maybe you think, "Am I becoming distant? Am I being unfair?" But what's actually happening is often something else entirely. You're no longer playing the emotional role the relationship once required. The role of constant understanding, constant forgiveness, constant emotional repair. And when that role disappears, the narcissist may try reframing the story, turning your boundaries into the problem. Sometimes they begin acting like the person you met at the start. More charming, more attentive, more emotionally expressive. They might bring up old memories, trips you took together, conversations you shared, moments that once felt special, and this can feel incredibly powerful because those memories still live inside you. But here's something important. They often appear when the narcissist senses the emotional connection weakening. It's an attempt to revive the original attachment. Another subtle shift begins happening. They start watching you more carefully. Your tone, your facial expressions, your responses. Almost like they are studying you, trying to understand what changed. You might notice questions like, are you upset? Why are you being so quiet? What's wrong with you? These questions aren't always about concern. Sometimes they're about regaining emotional insight, trying to figure out where their influence stands. This is a powerful one, because healing often brings independence. You start focusing on yourself again, your goals, your friendships, your emotional well-being. And suddenly, the narcissist seems irritated by things that once didn't bother them. Your confidence, your calmness, your emotional distance. Because independence can feel threatening to someone who relied on emotional control. And this final sign is often the most revealing. Something about their behavior begins feeling less powerful. The manipulation loses its impact. The guilt trips don't work the same way. The emotional pressure feels weaker. Not because they changed, but because you did. Your awareness became stronger. Your boundaries became clearer. Your reactions became intentional. And this is the moment the dynamic truly begins shifting. And when this shift begins happening, something else often changes quietly inside the dynamic. The emotional rhythm of the relationship becomes unfamiliar to them. Because for a long time, the pattern may have worked in a predictable way. They would withdraw, you would reach out, they would criticize, you would explain. They would create tension, and you would try to restore peace. But once awareness begins, that rhythm slowly starts breaking. You may not argue the same way. You may not defend yourself the same way. You may not rush to fix every uncomfortable moment. And at first, this change may seem small, almost invisible. But psychologically, it can feel very significant to someone who was used to emotional control. Because control in narcissistic dynamics is rarely about obvious power. It's about predictable reactions, predictable emotional patterns, predictable responses. And when those responses begin disappearing, the environment becomes uncertain. They may feel it in subtle ways. Maybe conversations feel different. Maybe arguments don't escalate the way they used to. Maybe your silence lasts longer than before. And silence in these moments can feel extremely revealing, because silence creates space, and space allows reality to become clearer. You begin observing more, listening more, questioning more. And this quiet awareness is something narcissistic dynamics struggle to survive. Not because you become confrontational, but because you become emotionally unavailable to manipulation. And this is where another interesting shift sometimes happens. The narcissist may start increasing emotional intensity. More dramatic conversations, more sudden declarations, more emotional pressure. Almost as if they are trying to restart the old dynamic, trying to pull you back into the familiar rhythm. But when your awareness is growing, those attempts begin feeling different, less convincing, less powerful, and sometimes even predictable. You may notice yourself thinking, I've seen this before. I know where this conversation is going. I know what happens next. And that moment of recognition can feel incredibly powerful. Because for a long time, the relationship may have felt confusing, unpredictable, emotionally overwhelming. But now, you begin seeing the structure behind the behavior, the patterns, the repetition, the emotional triggers. And once the pattern becomes visible, the illusion begins weakening. Not all at once, but gradually. The emotional grip starts loosening, the guilt becomes less effective, the manipulation becomes easier to recognize, and slowly, your emotional center begins shifting back to where it always belonged, inside you. Your sense of stability stops depending on their moods. Your peace stops depending on their approval. Your identity stops depending on their version of reality. And this is one of the most important moments in recovery, because awareness alone doesn't end the cycle, but it changes the way you experience it. It creates distance, clarity, perspective, and from that place, new choices become possible. Choices that once felt impossible. And that is often the moment when survivors realize something deeply empowering. The dynamic that once felt impossible to escape is already beginning to lose its hold. Take a moment and think about your own experience. Have you noticed any of these shifts? Moments where their behavior suddenly changed, right when your awareness started growing? For many survivors, these realizations arrive slowly, but once they appear, they create something powerful. Clarity. And clarity changes everything, because the emotional fog begins lifting, the confusion begins fading. You start recognizing patterns instead of isolated moments. You stop chasing emotional consistency from someone who cannot provide it. And instead, you begin building something much more important. Your own stability, your own emotional safety, your own peace. And that is where true healing begins. If you recognize these signs, please remember something important. You're not imagining the patterns. You're not overreacting. What you experienced was real, but awareness is the beginning of freedom. Because once you see the dynamic clearly, you begin reclaiming your power. And step by step, you begin reclaiming your life. The guilt trips don't whoop. If this video helped you understand something about your experience, consider subscribing. This channel exists to help you understand narcissistic relationships and to help you heal and move forward. You survived the relationship. Here, we help you survive it too. And if you've ever wondered why narcissists seem to move on so quickly, the next video on this channel explains exactly why they replace people so fast.